from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Kaylee Lyons. Escalation at sea. The Pentagon confirms the U.S. sank an Iranian warship in international waters with a torpedo fired by a submarine, the first strike of its kind since World War II. Iran denies it sought talks with Washington, undercutting hopes for a diplomatic off-ramp. President Trump, however, says the operation is going better than expected.
We're doing very well on the war front, to put it mildly, I would say. Somebody said, on a scale of 10, where would you rate it? I said about a 15.
Later this hour, Goldman Sachs CEO David Solomon joins Bloomberg on the geopolitical risks facing the global economy and markets. Plus, gaveling in. A war powers resolution aimed at limiting the president's authority in the Iran conflict is on track to fail a procedural vote in the Senate, with the House set to take up its own measure tomorrow. We'll speak with Florida Congresswoman Maria Salazar in just a few moments. And Trump teases endorsement. The president says he'll weigh in soon on the competitive Republican Texas Senate primary race that's heading to a runoff, with several outlets reporting Senator John Cornyn is expected to receive his backing. Texas Bureau Chief Julie Fine will be with us to discuss. But we begin this evening on Capitol Hill, where a war powers resolution is on track to fail a procedural vote in the Senate. Bloomberg's Myles Miller is joining us from there now live. So, Myles, it's no surprise we did expect this measure would not pass. Is there any Republican support for it?
Yeah, well, of course, the lone Republican who is supporting this is Rand Paul, of course, because he helped to bring this bill to the floor. As you said, the Senate voting right now on that war powers resolution that would require President Trump to get congressional authorization before ordering any additional military strikes on Iran. Now, this measure, of course, led by Senate Democrats with that one notable backer in Rand Paul of Kentucky. Of course, it's expected to fall short. One thing that was not a shock to any of us on the Hill was that, of course, Pennsylvania Democrat John Fetterman broke with his party to vote against it, aligning with the bulk of Republicans in opposition. The vote itself had its share of drama on the floor, with Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer rising to make a point of order. He was told that he couldn't make a point of order. Louisiana Republican John Kennedy drew attention when he asked if he had even voted on the measure. This really gets to the heart of this. It's a deeply divided Senate, even worse in the House. And some senators were even scrambling to get back to the Capitol to make this vote. Some of them were at the White House for that tech meeting, and so they were trying to get back here in time for the tally. The debate has really centered on whether Congress should assert its constitutional war-making authority or leave the president free to continue strikes without any additional approval. One thing worth noting is that supporters say lawmakers need to go on the record, and opponents are tying the president's hand during an active operation, and they say that that is essential to national security. Now, this comes as House Speaker Mike Johnson said just today that this characterization of this conflict of itself as a war is not correct. He said that the president and even the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth have both used that word, but that this is not actually a war. He described this campaign as a specific targeted military operation and not a war, and he's also dismissed calls for war powers on the House side. But of course, as you know, that is coming up tomorrow with staunch opposition from Democrats in the House. We'll see how that bill does when they take it up tomorrow afternoon. That's the latest here. I'll send it back to you.
All right, Bloomberg's Myles Miller reporting live from Capitol Hill. Thank you so much. And Myles is right. The president has referred to this conflict with Iran as a war. He did so again this afternoon at a roundtable with tech executives where he expressed confidence in the campaign. Take a listen.
We're doing very well on the war front. We're in a very strong position now, and their leadership is just rapidly going. Everybody that seems to want to be a leader, they end up dead. Their missiles are being wiped out rapidly. Their launchers are being wiped out. We're in very good shape now. I want to let you know that, and we will continue forward.
For more, we turn to Bloomberg's Jeff Mason. So, Jeff, take the words of the president and of the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth this morning, who said this is only just beginning. Doesn't sound like an administration that's looking for any kind of off-ramp at this point.
It also doesn't sound like an operation that's not a war.
I think that's a really interesting debate, to not call it a war when the president himself is calling it a war and is talking about the fact that it's going to go on for weeks, if not longer. So yeah, this is clearly an administration, a White House and a Pentagon that is prepping for more operations, for more attacks. And if the president sees this as a success, I think it's important to note that it's pretty unlikely that he would call it anything but a success. He's also someone who's prone to say we're ahead of schedule, even if there isn't a schedule, and the schedule for this particular operation has not really been laid out for the American public. But you can hear the confidence in his voice. He's pleased about how things are going, and it's going to keep going in that direction.
Well, of course, we also heard from the White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt today, who was asked explicitly about the notion of sending in ground troops, Jeff, something the president has not ruled out. She said it's not the plan at this time. Do we know if there's active conversations underway about that possibility?
I don't know if there are active conversations about it. You're spot on to say that the president has not ruled it out, and there also hasn't been activity that would suggest that ground troops are getting in place to go into Iran. Of course, we know that there was a great deal of activity before these strikes in terms of moving U.S. assets into the region, aircraft carriers, et cetera. That is not happening in terms of a troop buildup. It's also interesting politically that the president is not ruling out sending in troops, and Caroline Leavitt saying that's not the plan is no doubt in part an attempt to tamp down speculation that that's on the list. But politically, it would make this probably even more unpopular with some of the president's base, not to mention Democrats, because sending troops in would certainly rekindle the debate about whether he should have asked for permission or gotten a vote from Congress before doing this operation in the first place.
All right, Bloomberg's Jeff Mason covering the White House for us. Thank you so much. And joining me now with her insight and analysis is Dana Stroul. She's research director at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. She's also the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East under the Biden administration. Dana, thank you so much for being with us. When we consider the language we're hearing from the administration, Pete Hegseth suggesting that this is only just the beginning, the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, even the president suggesting bigger waves are still to come. What could we still be in for here now that we've already seen 5 days of strikes and 2,000 targets hit?
Well, first of all, what I think is important to understand about the phases of this campaign is that in those first 48 hours, Israel and the United States together took out all of Iran's air defense and achieved air supremacy so they can now fly over the skies of Iran. And now what they're doing is an even more kinetic, more aggressive part of the campaign. They're going to try to take out all of the missile infrastructure in Iran that's threatening the entire region. So not just the warehouses of missiles, but the launchers, the ways in which the Iranians are producing the missiles. They're going to go after the drones. And what's clear is that in the past 24 to 36 hours, the pace of those missile and drone attacks is going down, but there's still more work to do, and that's why this is going to take some time.
Well, and so when we consider those drone attacks and missile attacks that you're referring to, we've been talking frequently here at Bloomberg about how there is an asymmetry in costs associated. Those drones are cheaper to send out than they are to shoot down. We're using very expensive munitions here, Dana, and I wonder for how long you realistically think that's sustainable when the Pentagon is saying that we essentially can continue this conflict indefinitely. Can we really do that at this cadence?
Well, I don't think that any campaign can continue indefinitely, but really what CENTCOM with the U.S. military and Israel are doing is this race against time to get as many of the launchers out. And what they're doing, what they say is, this is the best defense is a really strong offense. So rather than work on defending when those missiles and those drones are in the air, we're going to get them at the origin site. And that's why we're actually in a more aggressive part of this campaign.
Well, when we consider the campaign, which, of course, the U.S. is not going it alone, Israel is also included in this. And there has been discussion about the U.S. Either coordinating with or even potentially arming Kurdish fighters in order to take part. There has been reporting today from outlets like Axios and Fox that indeed Kurdish forces are mobilizing in northern Iran. We heard earlier today on Bloomberg, my colleague David Gura sat down with former Secretary of State who you served with in the Biden administration, Antony Blinken. And this is what he said about the idea of arming the Kurds. Take a listen.
It's incredibly fraught and incredibly dangerous. And as sympathetic as I am to the Kurds, who've been incredible partners for us, incredibly brave, I don't think that getting into the business of arming these groups is ultimately going to be a good thing. And then you're going to have other countries that pick their partners inside. And again, you wind up with something like Syria, something like Libya.
So that's from someone who used to head up state, but I am curious your perspective from the DOD. Is there a military benefit, perhaps, to doing this?
Well, I think the most important question is what is the end state on the other side of fighting? And that is something that we have not heard from President Trump or anybody in his cabinet, and not even today in the briefing this morning with Hegseth and General Kane, the chairman. So rather than thinking about different tactics, the question is to achieve what? Are we trying to change the regime? Are we trying to empower opposition to lead to a democratic transition in Iran? Those are the questions that we really don't have answers to. And so what we're left with are these tactics. Arming Kurdish separatists to do what? And if we can't answer that question, then I think these are really dangerous means without identifying what the end is.
Well, so when we consider that end game or the day after, however you want to phrase it, Dana, obviously President Trump yesterday, when asked about this in the Oval Office, what the worst case scenario would be, he said the idea is the worst case scenario would be the U.S. does all of this and someone even worse than the supreme leader comes into power. When we consider that the U.S. wants to see a more moderate regime put into place, if military means need to be used to bring that about, can you do that strictly from an aerial warfare perspective? Would that require troops on the ground?
Well, there's no historical model that would show us that just air power alone can bring about regime collapse, regime change, or usher in a new government that would be accountable and responsible to all Iranians. So whether the answer is ground forces or whether it's actually a whole of government strategy with an international coalition and development and technical aid, those are the big questions that, again, this administration is not articulating.
Of course, this administration, Dana, is also very sensitive to the economic impact this could have globally, but also domestically when it comes to prices at the pump. And perhaps that's why President Trump said the U.S. will be willing to provide insurance, possibly even naval escorts to vessels that need to transit the Strait of Hormuz. I spoke with General Frank McKenzie, the former commander of U.S. Central Command, about what that would entail from a U.S. Navy perspective. This is what he told me.
The other part of their plan will be their vast armada of small craft that can get out into the Gulf, into the Strait of Hormuz, and interfere with shipping. We're going after them right now. What you'd like to do is prevent this from becoming a problem. Don't let these forces operate. Don't let them drop mines, because it's always harder to sweep the mines than it is to destroy the mines while they're still in their storage areas. We're very much aware of this problem. The U.S. Navy is very much aware of this problem.
So when you consider this problem and our military's ability to address it, just how fraught is this idea that we could be expending resources to escort these tankers?
I think it is incredibly fraught, and regardless of whether it's a possibility, it's not a near-term fix for the urgency of the situation. And again, this is where the best defense is a strong offense. And what Hegseth and CENTCOM are doing is trying to sink the entire Iranian Navy. First, they're going after the larger ships, and then I expect them to go after these smaller surface crafts, which General McKenzie was speaking about. So again, this is why I think we're hearing that this is going to take days or weeks, because all of this is part of a plan to stop all the ways in which the Iranians could threaten regional stability, freedom of navigation, global energy markets.
All right, Dana Stroul, we so appreciate it. Research Director at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Thank you so much. And as we consider potential disruptions to global energy markets, that's what the oil market and natural gas, for that matter, has been contending with for the last few days. So let's get a check on that now, as well as other elements of today's trade as we turn to power moves with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick joining us live from World Headquarters in New York. Romaine.
Well, Kelly, the good news is that some of the volatility and spikes that we saw in energy prices over the past couple of days, at least here on this Wednesday, did stabilize to just an extent. We should point out, though, that those prices are still elevated, well above where they were just about 4 or 5 days ago. That includes Brent crude over there in Europe. It includes WTI crude here in the U.S. European gas prices, diesel prices also elevated as well. But as that volatility in that space tamped down, you saw a pullback in the dollar and you saw dip buyers return to the equity market. All of the major U.S. indices finishing in the green, including 0.8% move on the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ up about 1.5%. The big question, Kaylee, is does this continue tomorrow, this bit of a rally that we had? Some of that, of course, is dependent on what comes out of Trump and the Pentagon over the next 24 hours. But a lot of it also is going to be dependent on some of the earnings. We just got some out of chipmaker Broadcom. It is the 6th highest weighting in the S&P 500. The company's conference call just starting about 15 minutes ago. The company says that there is an AI story there, providing a forecast saying that of its overall, with its revenue, about $10.7 billion of its revenue will be directly tied to AI chips. That's about 16% higher, Kaylee, than what the street was looking for. Those shares in the after-hours trade up about 4%.
All right, Bloomberg's Romaine Bostic, thank you so much. Coming up, President Trump says an endorsement is coming soon in Texas, where the Republican Senate primary is heading to a runoff. We'll have details next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Elections are about choices, and the choice in the Republican race for the U.S. Senate is crystal clear. There is simply too much at stake in this midterm election for our state and for our country.
For too long, he sold us out to Democrats. Those days are coming to an end. And now, as we head into this runoff, we're going to make the choice even clearer.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kaylee Lyons, and that was incumbent Texas Senator John Cornyn and Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton speaking last night after voters sent the pair to a runoff election in the state's Republican Senate primary. The president today teasing he'll endorse one of those candidates soon and ask the other to drop out. The winner of the runoff will face State Representative James Tallarico, who defeated Democratic Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett in that party's primary. Joining me now with the latest details is Bloomberg's Texas Bureau Chief Julie Fine, live from our Dallas bureau. So, Julie, could a Trump endorsement end this runoff before it's even really begun?
Well, I think that's what the president is hoping, because he said, I plan on endorsing in this race, and then whoever I don't endorse should drop out. So I think that's what he's hoping. The question is, does that happen? It will be very interesting if he endorses Senator Cornyn, because Ken Paxton was a very early supporter of his, very early on. So there's part of me that wonders if it has something to do with Cornyn, if they're trying to figure something out for Paxton or vice versa. But again, the president said this will be soon, certainly gave no timetable on that.
Well, how much of this, Julie, comes down to Republicans' feelings about who has the better chance of defeating James Tallarico, who's seen as a rising Democratic star?
Well, I will say this. John Cornyn raised an enormous amount of money in this primary. Between all 5 of the candidates, more than $120 million, major candidates, I should say, more than $120 million was raised, most of that from Senator Cornyn. So I think they realize, I would imagine the NRSC really does realize, there will be a lot of money sunk into this race. And if there's a lot sunk into Texas, well, it's not going somewhere else, that it may be needed. So I imagine there will be some pressure on President Trump to make a decision and to make it fairly quickly.
All right, Bloomberg's Texas Bureau Chief Julie Fine, awesome coverage over the last few days. Thank you so much. And joining us now with their reaction to those primary results is this evening's political panel. Archie Siddiqui, Democratic strategist and founder and CEO of Bellwether Government Affairs, is with me alongside Republican strategist Lester Munson, principal of the international practice at BGR Group. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll come to you first, Lester, as the Republican, knowing that Julie is right. There was an incredible amount of money poured in by the party and the NRSC in order to try to degrade Paxton and uplift Cornyn. If the president makes this endorsement now, is it primarily a financial decision?
Well, of course. I mean, that's a big part of this. Cornyn did a lot better than people thought, I will say. He's been a stalwart of the party for a very long time. He, too, has been an ally of President Trump for a very long time. He's got the best chance in the general election. That's also what's really driving this. And I think folks are well aware that Tallarico could pose a real threat to someone like Paxton in general. So Cornyn seems to be the smart choice, and I'm hoping that's where the president lands.
Well, so let's talk about Tallarico. Obviously, someone who's seen as a devout Christian. He pitched himself as someone who can appeal to more moderate, even some conservative voters in Texas. But Democrats have had this dream in Texas before and have spent a lot of money trying to flip the seat blue before. How do you feel about whether or not the party's chances are better of James Tallarico having success than, say, someone like Beto O'Rourke?
Well, listen, I think he ran a really smart campaign. He also, it's a big tent strategy, as you just mentioned, and I think that was the smart piece, whereas Trump voters can still vote Tallarico because this is a little bit more about checks and balances and really making sure that the country can move forward under kind of a more of a big tent approach.
Well, and so what does that say about knowing that Tallarico was running that kind of campaign versus Jasmine Crockett, who suggested, no, I'm going to be all about turning out the Democratic base? Does her loss suggest that is not a playbook Democrats should run with in November?
These races have to be so tailored to different states. I mean, we've talked a lot about the New York City mayoral race. That was tailored to New York at a given time. Similarly, Texas has to be tailored to Texas. I think Jasmine Crockett ran a great campaign, a lot of energy, but ultimately it was actually a good result that Tallarico was able to win with a margin and really win with a margin of bringing people together. And I think we also saw from Jasmine Crockett today that she also encouraged everybody, Democrats, to come together in backing Democratic candidates as well.
Well, and when we consider that margin, he, of course, was able to exceed a margin that made sure he didn't need to go to a runoff like we're seeing in the Republicans. Talk to us, Lester, about runoff turnout. Because obviously primary voters already are some of the most politically engaged. Then if you're showing up a second time before the general election, who is that voter? Who are they likely to support?
Yeah, money matters, for sure, and social media messaging matters, and you're going for a pretty small segment of a general election constituency here. So you have to be intense, you have to be fast, you have to be smart and nimble. Cornyn, he's been through a lot. I'll say this about him. He's been through a lot of battles. He's seen a lot of things. He ran the NRSC, which is the campaign arm for Senate Republicans, for a long time. He's a smart guy. He's very politically astute. I think the smart money is still on him to prevail here because I think he's already kind of exceeded expectations for a lot of people. So I'm fairly optimistic here.
Well, when we consider things that might factor into the midterms, obviously there is a bit of a split within the Republican Party right now over the Epstein files. And I do quickly, in our remaining moment here, want to mention that the House Oversight Committee voted today to subpoena the Attorney General Pam Bondi over the Epstein files. 5 Republicans voted for this. Archie, what does that tell you?
What tells you is that the story continues to shift on Epstein, and so I think people want answers, and a lot of Republicans want answers because it contradicts directly what the Attorney General has stated in other instances.
Color, are you surprised, Lester, or no?
Not at all. This is classic Washington behavior. It's not the crime, it's the cover-up, or the perceived cover-up. And so people are looking at, did you not send us everything? Did you send it the wrong way? Did you expose the wrong things? Those are the questions that are becoming more and more pertinent. So it's kind of following the classic Washington model, if you ask me.
All right, Lester Munson, Archie Siddiqui, thank you both so much. You'll be back with me for more later on this hour. And I do want to mention some breaking news here on Bloomberg TV and radio. We mentioned that the war powers vote in the Senate was on track to fail. Not surprising, but it has now indeed failed. The final vote, 47 to 53. Of course, there was very little Republican support for this measure. Again, that resolution has failed in the Senate as expected. A similar resolution in the House will fail tomorrow. So still ahead, we'll talk more about what this resolution is supposed to address, the ongoing war with Iran now in its 5th day. We'll have reaction from Republican Congresswoman Maria Salazar of Florida, a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kaylee Lines. It's day 5 of the U.S. and Israel's war with Iran, and the Trump administration is signaling today that the strikes against the Islamic Republic have only just begun, as Iran pushes back on reports that its operatives have reached out to the U.S. for talks. But if there is to be any off-ramp for the conflict, former U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says it will be governed by 2 factors: munitions and markets. In an exclusive interview with Bloomberg's David Gura for the Big Take podcast, Blinken says a striking feature of this conflict is the extent to which Iran has involved its neighbors. Here's a piece of their conversation.
What I'm worried about, one of the things I'm worried about, and this gets to the second and third order consequences, is we so deplete our arsenal, and it takes a long time to rebuild it, that puts us in a disadvantageous position when it comes to, say, a China or a Russia. All of those things need to be factored in. And again, it's one of the reasons why if you're going to undertake something like this, you've got to make sure that you've factored all of that in. And again, it really should start with explaining to the American people why you're doing something, why it's necessary, why now.
Do you see an off-ramp anywhere at this point?
I do, in the sense that, one, as I said, I think the off-ramp will be governed by this question of munitions and markets. Mm-hmm. And then what is that off-ramp? I think the president may simply declare victory. He'll say, got rid of the Ayatollah. We diminished or degraded or destroyed their nuclear program again. We did the same thing to the missile program. We did the same thing to the Navy. And as to the regime, well, over to the Iranian people. Good luck to them. Hope they succeed. And if they don't, it's their fault. If they do, we'll take the credit. How Iran responds to that remains to be seen. And for the regime, survival is success. Right now, the expectation seems to be, at least as has been reported, that the Ayatollah's son is his successor. He's very tied into the IRGC. And so you may have a situation where, much as we want, and everyone should want to see a change in that regime, we have, regime change without regime change.
Status quo.
Status quo. And even potentially, even worse, because it may simply ultimately reinforce the IRGC, the military, mm-hmm. the specialized military. And part of the problem with these things is that it's very hard to produce regime change from outside. You can't bomb your way to it. We've had a lot of experience with that, and not such good experience over the last 20 years. It's even not so likely to come from the streets, even with the extraordinarily courageous Iranian people. It's more likely to come from kind of within the palace. And then it could go in any one of, multiple directions. You could get more pragmatic people, not good guys, but more pragmatic people who are open to, curbing the excesses of the regime, focusing at home instead of focusing abroad, doing deals. But right now, it looks more likely that you're going to have hardliners.
You can find the full conversation between former Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Bloomberg's David Gura on the Big Take podcast online or on the terminal. And joining us now with more from Capitol Hill is Republican Congresswoman Maria Salazar of Florida, who serves on both the House Foreign Affairs Committee and Financial Services Committee. Congresswoman, thank you very much for being with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. The War Powers Resolution in the Senate just failed. No surprise. We knew it wasn't likely to pass, just like we know the one in your chamber tomorrow is not likely to pass. I know you yourself are not supportive of a War Powers Resolution at this time. Is there a situation in which you would be supportive of reining in what the president can do militarily here? What if he wants to send in ground troops, for example?
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I just wanted to add something that while I was listening to what Secretary Blinken said, that we have to explain to the American people. I think what we have to explain to the American people is that President Trump has used his powers as commander-in-chief to be able to liberate and to prevent an attack from the Iranians to our neighbors, our Arab neighbors, our Arab friends, Israel, and the United States. That is what we're looking at this scenario in very different fashion, in very different ways. And that's why it failed. This resolution failed in the Senate and is going to fail tomorrow in the House because Trump has created a new blueprint. It's like a new groundwork that he has put together in the sense that he is creating this platform for the bad guys to lay the work and the way to the good guys. And that's what we're doing now in Iran. What happened in Iran? We prevented a very major conflict that was going to come if we did not stop the 100 a month ballistic missiles that they were creating. That's what I think, that we do not need any resolution, because this is not going to be a long-term conflict.
Well, Congresswoman, you refer to this as the president creating a blueprint. What would you say to someone who asked if the blueprint actually being created here is that Congress's authority is no longer one of war powers, that Congress does not need to be asked about that?
Because we are not entering into a war, which is what happened with Venezuela. What we're doing is that we are preventing from an enemy to attacking the mainland and attacking our neighbors and attacking Israel in the case of the Ayatollahs. We have liberated the Middle East from the worst evil empire that region could have seen in the last 100 years. I just told you, 100 ballistic missiles a month. For what? Why, when we offer them liquid nuclear fuel for them to be able to create and to enhance their own civilian nuclear program, they said, no, 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 we want to create our own nuclear weapons. So right there, we know what their intentions are. And what did we do at the White House? We stopped it, because the intentions were not good for the Arabs, for the Israelis, and for the Americans.
Well, of course, stopping it and taking out these thousands of targets has come at a cost of munitions. And of course, the expense of those munitions can be substantial, which is why there is now a live conversation about whether supplemental funding will be required. We spoke with your colleague, Republican Mike Rounds, the senator, about this on Balance of Power last night. This is what he told me. I'll have you respond.
We do know that we've still got munitions available to us. But anytime you expend munitions, you want to make sure that you're in a position to replace those munitions as quickly as possible. And so if, in the middle of this process over the next several weeks, they decide that they're going to ask for a supplemental, I most certainly would consider it, or as a part of the appropriations process. I think the president's indicated he'd like to go up about $500 billion in additional expenditures for the next coming year.
And I am willing to vote for it as well. I'm willing to vote for it as well.
On what timeline do you think that could come together?
Whatever the White House and whatever leadership in the GOP and the House of Representatives decides, if we need to allocate, to appropriate, and to authorize that money, we will. Because all we're doing is that we're preventing from entering into a long-term conflict with Iran. That is exactly why are we there? Why did we bomb them? Because we knew the Ayatollahs were negotiating in bad faith, A, because they were creating a ballistic missile program that was going to outnumber our ballistic missiles, the Israelis and the rest of the Arab-friendly countries. So that's what we did. This action has prevented a long-term conflict, which is when the president would need to come to Congress and ask for permission. That's not the scenario at this hour.
Congresswoman, I'm sure you're well aware that there is a bit of a live conversation within the Republican Party right now about whether or not this president is still sticking to America First beliefs, as we see not only this action now in Iran, but the action you referred to earlier in Venezuela, the capturing of Maduro. And I'm wondering if you do see this as a more interventionist president, and if we are going to be intervening, should Cuba be next?
And I agree with you that this is, it all depends on how you see it. This is an America First agenda, because we are protecting and preventing our enemies from attacking the mainland and for continuing doing harm to our children. And so that is America First. He is putting America first by taking out Maduro, who was sending not only the Tren de Aragua and terrorists and drugs. So we put him out, and that's not happening anymore. And he's not using the oil, the Venezuelan oil, to fuel terrorist groups in the United States, like Tren de Aragua. Number two, Iran. So we are stopping him. So that's America First. We're stopping the Ayatollahs from harming not only the United States with the interballistic missiles, but harming our #1 ally in the Middle East, which is Israel. So yeah, that's an America First agenda, of course.
And what about Cuba, Congresswoman? Would you like to see action there?
Cuba is the mothership of evil. What the Ayatollahs were in the Middle East is what the Castros are in the Western Hemisphere. The mothership of evil. Because Castro wrote the manual on repression and on how to maintain power at all costs. So now Cuba is next. And that's exactly what the president needs to do, because like the Ayatollahs and Iran was just hanging by a thread, so is the Cuban regime. Right now, I hear the latest reports is that they haven't had, they meaning the whole island is in darkness. There's no electricity, there's no fuel, there's no gas. So that means that there's no food, there's no water. Why? Because the Cubans are in the business of power, just like the Ayatollahs, just like Maduro. They're all in the business of power, not in the business of feeding their population and making them happy. That's why Cuba should be next, no doubt about it. And I represent the Cuban exile community in Miami, and we are waiting, because that's an America First agenda as well.
Well, and Congresswoman, I would like to talk about that constituency you have and representative constituencies elsewhere, the Hispanic community across the country. I know you represent Florida, but I wonder if you look at what we saw in Texas yesterday and what happened with Hispanic voter turnout in particular, and I wonder if that gives you concern as your party moves forward into November.
Great concern, because as you know, I wrote the only immigration reform bill on the table in Congress, because the Hispanics came to the GOP in 24 in masses. 1 out of 2 Hispanic males voted for President Trump. The problem is that the directives coming from the White House, when it comes to the deportations, they were not the directives that many of us thought that it was going to be. The president promised that he was going to do the largest mass deportation in the history of the country. We agree with that. The bad hombres, the illegal-to-work criminals, the criminals, not the people who have no criminal record. Because those people, I mean, who are illegal as well, but we need to have another type of conversation. What are we going to do with the gardener, not the gangster? We know what we're going to do with the gangster. What are we going to do with the nanny, not the narco? So that is what I am inviting my party, the GOP, to start that conversation before the midterms in November of 26, because we need to bring back the Hispanics, the largest and fastest growing minority in the country. They need to be with us. And we need to show them that we are in favor of their interest, which is not to deport someone who does not have a criminal record. Let's find another status, the dignity status. No citizenship, no amnesty, no citizenship, dignity.
All right, we will leave it there. Congresswoman, I so appreciate your time. Republican Congresswoman Maria Salazar of Florida, thank you so much. And still ahead, we'll take you live on the ground to Goldman Sachs Australia Week, the Alternatives and Macro Summit in Sydney, for a conversation between Goldman Sachs CEO David Solomon and Bloomberg's The Asia Trade anchor Heidi Stroud-Watts. That's still ahead on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
As President Trump said, more and larger waves are coming. We are just getting started. We are accelerating, not decelerating. Iran's capabilities are evaporating by the hour, while American strength grows fiercer, smarter, and utterly dominant. 4 days in, we have only just begun to fight. America fights to win. And in Operation Epic Fury, we are.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kaylee Lines, and that was Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth this morning, sharing that the U.S. is just getting started when it comes to combat operations in Iran. Back with me now with their reaction is this evening's political panel, Arshie Siddiqui, Democratic strategist and founder and CEO of Bellwether Government Affairs, alongside Republican strategist Lester Munson, principal of the international practice at BGR Group. Lester, we have heard not just from the Defense Secretary, but repeatedly from the president, the notion that we are winning this. Yet have they made a proper enough case to the American people as to what exactly it is that we're trying to win?
Well, I do think there's been at least a couple of different explanations. But I think at heart, the message has been pretty clear through all of the statements President Trump has put out and some of the stuff he's done live, where he has discussed the open hostility from Iran against the United States going back to 1979. They've killed Americans any number of times. You go back to the Marine barracks bombing in the early 1980s, to the use of IEDs against American troops in Iraq in the early part of the 2000s, which was extensive and very significant, to their support for Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, all of whom have targeted Americans at various times, including during the October 7th 2023 attack on Israel, where some Americans were killed and taken hostage. So there is a terrific case that Iran has brought this on itself. There's no doubt that on Saturday morning, it was an opportune time for the U.S. to strike. We had all of the bad guys in one room at one time, and we knew where they were, and we got the result we wanted. So I think at the end of the day, when you pull back from some of the splitting of hairs, the explanation is actually pretty solid.
Okay, so if that's the case, I wonder, Archie, if you feel free to agree or disagree, but how you think this ultimately does play politically at home when we know, at least polling has consistently showed us, that the vast majority of the electorate is still very much concerned with domestic affairs and the own costs that they're facing, and this potentially risks running up some of those costs.
Absolutely, because you referenced that there is going to be a supplemental. This is going to cost a lot of money. It's already costing a lot of money. But just taking a step back, I mean, there's no love lost. There's bipartisan opposition to the Iranian regime. No problem. So if everything Lester's saying is true, then why didn't they come to the Democrats? Why didn't we have a strong rationale and showing? Because right now, the rationale changes depending on who you ask in the administration, one. And two is the story, as it continues to change, there's no strategic roadmap going forward. And so I think for Democrats, the question becomes this is in direct contradiction of the president's campaign in terms of his priorities. And, you know, we have tariffs increasing this week. We have the Affordable Care Act subsidies that were not addressed. So across the board, American families are paying the price, whereas there's a juxtaposition between that and what we're seeing abroad.
Well, and so as you make reference to the idea, and Lester, you kind of spoke to this too, about the timing of this, that the case was not really adequately made in advance, certainly not to Congress and not to the public. Your point was that the time to strike was now. They didn't have time to make the case. They have time now, and I guess this kind of gets back to my original question as to whether or not they are using it adequately. We've seen them all over the airways. They all seem to be telling different things, including suggestions that we have munitions to make this last forever, using the word forever in the case of President Trump. If we wanted to, do we not have some kind of risk here of this spilling in to, quote unquote, endless conflict?
Look, this is war. Whether we want to technically call it war or not, it is war or something a lot like it. And it is risky, and lives are going to be lost. And we should all be very grounded in the fact that we don't know exactly what's going to happen next for sure. And so I think we all, and I think you guys agree, is have some humility about the whole thing. It's as serious a question as there is. But, you know, the Senate just voted on the merits of this Iran war effectively, and it refused to disapprove of the action. Now, that's a little convoluted. But in my mind, that's effectively the Senate endorsing what President Trump has done. We're very likely to see a similar vote in the House tomorrow, where a resolution to disapprove of the war will we don't know yet, but it'll probably fail. And when it does, that'll effectively be the House supporting this. So it's not exactly as the Constitution intended, but because of the War Powers Resolution from 1973, we do this week have Congress weighing in on the conflict.
Do you think that calculus changes at all for Republicans if the president were to decide to use ground forces, which he has not ruled out?
Oh, 100%. And I think then you would be looking at a much more significant effort. And I think that would kind of change the calculus. And you might see demands for a more robust role for Congress and a deeper explanation for how long we're going to be there and what this is going to be like. And do we need a declaration of war or an authorization for the use of military force, which is much more likely? That's totally fair. But I really don't think there's a scenario where we're talking about overt ground troops in Iran.
Well, as we consider the different scenarios here, and Lester referred to this, as did you, the idea that we might need more money if this is going to carry on, that a supplemental request could be made to Congress. Do you see a world in which there could be Democratic support for that, A, because that money might go to getting those stranded in the Middle East out of the Middle East in terms of Americans, but also because we're expending a lot of our munitions, a lot of things that are supposed to provide security to the United States and our defenses. And if you're going to need money to replenish that, would Democrats be voting against making sure America is secure if they don't?
Yeah, and Kelly, I think that's why this time period is so critical in terms of the president and the administration making his case to Congress, because obviously we're in this now and the stakes are high, and this is Iran. And it's Iran in a very complicated region where there's all sorts of ripple effects. So I think from that perspective, I think Democrats are going to want to do what is best and getting Americans out of these countries where we have heard some stories where folks are stranded. They don't know where to go. They don't have clear instructions. And But on top of that, there are a lot of different other ramifications. There's also ramifications on other threats around the world. And where does this depletion of munitions, what type of position does that put America in? So there are a lot of different moving pieces here. And that's why I think for the administration, really, it might do some good to take a pause and really have some more robust outreach and discussion with Democrats, because ultimately this is a question of national security, and this is a question that should actually transcend politics and really go to the heart of our national security as a country.
Well, when we consider who is being cast out with this national security message, obviously the defense secretary, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff have given multiple briefings at this point. Secretary Rubio has spoken with reporters on Capitol Hill several times. We hear from the president on this as well. Who we are not hearing from, Lester, is the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, who also was not in Florida with everybody else who was in the makeshift situation room, essentially, at Mar-a-Lago. How loud is his relative silence on this, aside from one interview on Fox?
I think that he did have a message of, not sure this is the right thing, but if we're going to do it, we should go big and get the job done, which, I think a lot of Americans are going to find some salience with. I have no doubt that the vice president is going to fully support is supporting and will support what the president is doing in Iran. That's part of his job. He's a Marine. He's served in a combat zone. He knows what this is like. I think he's fairly grounded on what the politics are. And I'm willing to give him a lot of grace here.
He is all of those things. He is also seen as a potential 2028 contender, Archie. And I wonder how much you think that this entire situation in the Middle East makes that more complicated for him.
I just think it illustrates the fact that there was a pretty robust campaign about staying out of these quote-unquote forever wars. And now we look at Venezuela, we look here, and the question becomes is short-term results, sure, but what are the long-term ramifications? And that's where I think the administration has fallen short in terms of kind of really setting out a path in terms of how this is going to play out long term.
Well, and this was something the Congresswoman was speaking about with me just a moment ago. You were talking about how we're messing with the definition of war here, Lester. Are we also messing with the definition of what America First is?
Well, I think the definition of America First has always been kind of flexible.
Sure.
I think it was even John McCain, who is supposedly, antithetical to America First, was a nation first guy. So there's room for each politician to define that themselves, much like MAGA, Make America Great Again. What does that mean exactly? Folks can kind of define it. It all sounds very nice. You want to dive into the details, but I think on Iran, on this forever wars issue, in Venezuela, basically we saw a conflict that lasted about 4 hours. Yeah. In Iran, I think we're going to see something that maybe lasts for 4 weeks, maybe 8 weeks. Those aren't forever wars. Now, you may want to debate what are the merits of putting Delcy Rodriguez in charge of Venezuela, or like kind of the Persian Delcy in Tehran, whoever that may end up being. But I do know this. Right now, it looks a lot better than the Afghanistan and Iraq model, where we spent trillions of dollars, spent a ton of blood, and were there for 20 years, and it didn't exactly work the way we wanted.
But we have the Maduro regime still in power in Venezuela, so...
But we also have a Venezuela that is much more amenable to U.S. national interests.
We're going to have to get into the Venezuela debate another time because, unfortunately, we're out of time on today's show. But great stuff from both of you guys. Thank you so much. Archie Siddiqui and Lester Munson, my political panel this evening. Thank you so much. And, of course, for more coverage of the ongoing conflict with Iran now in day 5, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online. And come right back here to Balance of Power tomorrow on Bloomberg TV and radio.